All right, well, hello and thank you all for joining me today for the NLPA's members-only webinar, Key Elements of Effective Negotiating. I'll be turning over the reins to our guest presenter in just a moment, but I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items before we begin. Our NLPA member webinars have two parts. First will be the presentation, and then we'll follow with a question and answer session. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar by clicking on the Q&A section found in the lower right corner of the WebEx console. You'll select Next Level Purchasing Association, type your question in the box, and click Send. I will collect the questions and our presenter will answer them at the end of the event. A frequent question we get during these webinars is how can I get a copy of the slide deck? The slides and on-demand replays for this and most other NLPA webinars are a benefit of the NLPA library. Access to the NLPA library is available to members who meet any of these three criteria. 1, they are enrolled in the SPSM certification program. 2, they are currently certified SPSM in good standing. Or 3, they are enrolled in the All Access training program. If you meet any of these criteria, the slides are available to you in the NLPA library at this time. Also, to ensure the best audio quality, we recommend shutting down any non-essential programs, especially if you're streaming the audio through your computer. If you do encounter audio issues, there is a phone number to dial into the audio included in the registration confirmation email you received. All right, with that out of the way, it is truly my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Ernest Gabbard. Ernest has over 25 years of supply management and contract management experience and recently retired as the Executive Director of Strategic Sourcing for a Fortune 1000 corporation. In this position, he was the Senior Procurement Executive, having strategic responsibility for approximately $4 billion in global spend across 8 diverse divisions. Ernest was previously in Senior Procurement Management positions with Hughes Aircraft, Teledyne Industries, and Litton Industries. He has conducted business transactions in 34 countries and resided for almost 14 years in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. With that, Ernest, please take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for attending. I just want to touch on one quick thing before we get started, and that is I want to emphasize one aspect of my bio, and that is please recognize that I am first and foremost a procurement or supply management professional. I'm not speaking about theory, but real life that you and I live in. Another thing I would mention is I recognize that almost everyone that sits in this seminar today has some sort of experience or training in negotiation. So I believe it's my responsibility to share thoughts and insights which do not necessarily duplicate your existing or previous knowledge. For that reason, this will be a slightly different look at what is often, I would consider, one of the most neglected subjects in professionals' careers and one of the most valuable in our specific career path. So we're going to take a little bit different approach. Let's look at our agenda real quick. We're going to define negotiation. Now, the reason that we do that is there are hundreds of definitions of negotiation out there, and we want to kind of all be on the same page. So we're going to define what negotiation is. Then we're going to talk about this newer concept of strategic negotiation. What does it mean, and how does it apply to our real world? Then we're going to talk about major factors in failure. Now, there's an old saying that a smart man or woman learns from their mistakes, and a wise man or woman learns from other mistakes. We're going to try to learn from other people's mistakes. Now, the other side of that point is we're going to talk about what the keys to negotiating success may be. Now, the reason we do that is we want to look at what really contributes to success, whether it's strategies, tactics, or is in fact it something else. I want to just be sure that we recognize that we have a slightly different world that we operate in today than we did maybe many years ago. Okay, what is negotiation? I want to just provide a definition to give us a baseline. Our definition today is process of persuasion used to establish agreement. Now, there are many, many definitions of negotiation. I've discussed this in our seminars, and for the most part, almost everyone agrees this would be a valid definition. So let's use that as the baseline for the balance of our discussion. The process of persuasion used to establish agreement. Now, if that is our definition, I want to propose something real quick to everyone. Please consider that with that definition, much of the discussion, much of the dialogue we have in our daily lives is really a negotiation. Think about it. When I talk to my spouse or my significant other about we're going to go to dinner on Friday, and I have a preference and they have a preference, isn't that really a negotiation with this definition? When I talk to my boss about my work assignment or maybe a salary adjustment, isn't that really a negotiation? When I talk to my subordinates about their work assignment or the due date for the work assignment, that really fits this definition, doesn't it? So with that in mind, just think about how these principles can be applied to our lives every day. The reason I mention that is that I have had an opportunity to observe some of the best negotiators in the world, and I have found one thing to be quite clear, and that is the best negotiators in the world do not look at this as a duty or as an obligation. It is a life skill, and if we look at it that way, we can practice this skill every day, all day. So with that, let's talk about whether negotiation is an art or a science. Now, why does that really matter? Why do we care whether it's an art or a science? Well, we care because there are many books written about the art of negotiation and the science of negotiation. Now, for clarity, for those of you that may not be familiar with the terms, the art of negotiation is those aspects of negotiation that have to do with our people skills. They go beyond technical skills, their ability to read body language, to see in other people's conduct what they're really trying to say, to really be able to listen and understand the other party's position, to empathize as well as to negotiate. The science, on the other hand, is the technical skills, the understanding of strategies, understanding of tactics. We really need to know both. So I'm going to suggest that negotiation is both an art and a science, and to be successful, we need to have both. Now, another aspect I'd like to look at is whether negotiation is an event or process. Now, an event is where I walk into a room with a supplier and they sit across the table or their team sits across the table and we conduct a negotiation. That is the event. But really progressive negotiators recognize that that's not the start of the negotiation. The start of the negotiation is the first contact I have with that other party, whether it's personal or professional. That sets the stage for the negotiation as to whether they trust me or whether I trust them. So we need to look at negotiation as a process that begins with the very first contact with that other party. Whether that contact is through my organization or another organization, that's where it starts. And with that perspective, we can be more successful. Another question we get oftentimes is, what is strategic negotiation? Now, again, many definitions, but I want to propose that viewing negotiation as part of a holistic process is really strategic negotiation. Now, what makes it strategic? It is a holistic view. It is a long-term view. It is a strategic view and not a short-term, one-time transactional view or a view of the result. Now, the interesting thing about truly strategic negotiation is that results of strategic negotiations are not generally measured only in dollars. There are other measurements that we use for strategic negotiations. For example, if I obtain a wonderful price and I'm commended for the great price that I got from a supplier on a particular negotiation, but that supplier fails to perform or performs only marginally, was that a successful negotiation? And that's looking at the process and at the result more strategically. All right, let's move on then to talk about what are the most frequent negotiating mistakes. Now, I need to share with you the genesis of this list. My first job out of college and law school required that I negotiate. And I went to some training sessions and I got some experience and I studied under some pretty good negotiators and I got to be where I thought I was probably a fairly good negotiator. Now, the good results that I got in my negotiations often resulted in me receiving promotions or being elevated. And as I got to higher levels of management, I really had no opportunity to negotiate anymore. But I did have an opportunity to review and approve negotiation plans and the opportunity to sit in on innumerable negotiations with many different transactions of different types and sizes throughout the world. And I began to see a pattern in both the negotiation plans and in the negotiation conduct. These patterns, I recognized, were patterns that I had had in my negotiation experience as well. So I found that I really wasn't as an effective a negotiator as I thought I was. And I thought it would be valuable to categorize and to compile those negotiation mistakes to share with my staff and with others so that we could learn from the mistakes that we and others have made. Now, what's important in looking at the negotiating mistakes isn't just what we do, but why we do it. Why do we make certain mistakes and make them repeatedly and consistently? And these mistakes are really frequent in every culture in the world that I've participated in. So let's look at those things. The first one is not going to surprise you at all. The first one is inadequate preparation. The thing that might surprise us is if we look at the reason, the why. Why would someone go into a negotiation unprepared? Now, the most obvious answer, and the one that most of our seminar participants give, is, of course, lack of time. I didn't really have the time. I couldn't make it a priority. Other things took precedent, so I didn't really have the time to prepare as I should. Now, that's a very valid reason, but I want to tell you that from my personal and professional experience, that was not the primary reason people were inadequately prepared. It actually was because they didn't know how to prepare or didn't know what to do to prepare. Now, that may surprise you, but I worked with a company not very long ago who had, I believe, some of the best policies and procedures and practices on negotiation I have ever seen. They had templates for virtually everything, for calculating what their BAFO was, to calculate every element of the transaction, to balance the different elements with each other and determine what was the most important. But they were missing one of the most important components of preparation, and that was they were not taking the time and didn't have the templates or the processes by which they would obtain the other party's perspective. I'm going to propose to you, when we go into a negotiation and we do not understand what the other party wants, we are vulnerable. And I found my first job being on the negotiating contracts on the sales side, that salespeople are trained very carefully how to find out what our needs and our wants are on the purchasing side. But we do not receive the same kind of training. Our focus tends to be on what we need from the supplier rather than on what they may want or need. This results in inadequate preparation. The next most significant and most frequent is utilization of an inappropriate strategy. Now, what do we mean by an inappropriate strategy? Strategy is the overall view, if you will. It's the overall approach, whether we use a competitive or a cooperative or whatever, win-win, win-lose, that sort of thing. Strategy is very important, but we often found that people were using an inappropriate strategy. Now, again, we have to ask ourselves why. Why would someone use an inappropriate strategy? What we found was that you and I, ladies and gentlemen, are creatures of habit. We will tend to repeat conduct which has resulted in success. So if I was successful with a particular strategy, and maybe repeatedly successful with a particular strategy, I will tend to use that strategy whether it's appropriate or not. The way we overcome that is we learn various strategies and we learn which ones are really appropriate under the circumstances, and that way we can assure that we're not using an inappropriate strategy. All right. The next one that is, again, probably not going to surprise you is we tend, as buyers, as purchasing and contracting professionals, to focus on a single element. Now, generally, that is the price. Now, The problem with that is that limits our options to reach agreement. When we focus on one thing, oftentimes one thing that we don't have a lot of control over, and we'll talk about that later, when we focus on one thing, we really miss the opportunity to find a way to reach agreement with a supplier. Now, I want to propose to us that we need to expand our perspective and look beyond the single element. Our seminars attendees are often surprised that we come up with a list of 16 plus items that we can talk to suppliers about that impact the price but not actually ask for a change in price. And that's the kind of perspective we need to have, because that allows us to have the flexibility to perhaps satisfy both the supplier's needs and ours. The final one, and again there are other mistakes, but these are the primary categories. The final one is what I call a misunderstanding of power. Now, again, what is power? Power is leverage. Power is generally the ability to influence someone to reach the agreement that you want, to do what it is that you want. Now, again, that's whether it's personal or professional, and we need to understand that power often results from another person's vulnerability. And that vulnerability is something that we recognize, but we need to be cautious of, because an ancillary to misunderstanding power is the misuse of power, or what I call sometimes the abuse of power. This is the problem that we have when we don't recognize something we're going to talk about shortly, and that is that power shifts over time. So if a supplier holds me hostage, knowing that they are a single or a sole source and they obtain for me concessions I do not want to give to them, when I have the opportunity to buy from somewhere else, what do you think I'm going to do? Of course, I'm going to buy from someone else. Same thing on the supplier side. When I squeeze a supplier, as we used to say, until they hurt, and they have an opportunity to sell that product or service to someone else at a later time, they're going to do that. So we have to be careful that we don't misuse power and recognize that it does shift over time. Okay, I want to provide a little perspective for the balance of our discussion today. And let me do that by just saying, who it is it that in a negotiation that defines success? What is it that defines a successful negotiation? Is it the purchaser, the seller, the end user, my management, their management? Is it not, in fact, all of these parties? Don't every one of these parties ultimately have a contribution to, or in fact define, success? Now, are these parties likely to agree? Probably not. Will they not have differing viewpoints? So how does that affect our role? Because our role really ultimately is to reconcile the different definitions or views of what is success, isn't it? That's the perspective we need to have when we prepare a negotiation plan and when we participate in negotiation. Now, related to that, let's talk about an ancillary aspect. And that is, what should be the primary goal of any negotiation, personal or professional? What's the goal? Well, isn't it generally professionally to establish the right price and the right terms? But right for whom? Right for the buyer, or right for the seller, or right for the end user, or right for the engineer, or right for the program manager, or right for the manager? Now, remember our definition. Negotiation is a process to reach agreement. So with that definition, we need to determine right for whom. Now, won't that generally require some compromise? And if I'm going to establish compromise, how can we establish mutually beneficial goals? How can we determine what might benefit both parties in the transaction? Okay, the answer to this is we have to be prepared to share information. Now, if we are seeking information from the supplier, how do we obtain that information? By asking questions. Questions result in information. Information is what drives a negotiation. It is, in fact, what we call the currency of negotiation. My knowledge of your vulnerability will give me leverage, will it not? Your knowledge of what I really want versus what I need will give you an opportunity to reach a point of reconciliation of our two different types of needs. So, let me propose something. What is the single most important question a purchaser can ask any supplier? Let me repeat. The single most important question really any purchaser can ask any supplier. This is valid in almost every negotiation. Now let me give you a hint. First of all, this question establishes trust. It evokes trust between the two parties. Secondly, and equally important, the question is seldom asked. Now, how do I know it's seldom asked? Because when we asked suppliers this question, oftentimes they were surprised or in some cases shocked. And we asked them why, and they said, well, that's not a question our buyers generally ask us. So it is something that becomes even more important for us as buyers, as purchasing professionals. So what is that single most important question? Here it is. What can we do, that is you and I both, do to help you reduce your cost of providing this product or this service? Again, what can we do to help you reduce your cost of providing this product or service? Now think about the magnitude of this question. Notice, we are not requesting a cost or price decrease. Notice, we are not asking for the product to be delivered earlier or later. Notice that this indicates a sensitivity to their challenges, recognizing we actually do impact their cost of providing a product or service. Notice that it actually prompts a sharing of information, and again, information is currency, and notice that it creates a sense of cooperation or teamwork with the other party. This is very, very critical to us. We should never enter into a negotiation where we have not considered and asked this question. Now, let me just share with you what the results have been of asking this question. There are hundreds of results that we've had, well, actually thousands of results we've had. These are only a few selected for some fairly apparent reasons. We had a specification with a supplier that required a tolerance for a product be from plus or minus 0.005, a fairly tight tolerance, but a tolerance we had been buying a product on for years. The supplier answering our question, what can we do to help you, said, well, if you could actually change that to 0.05 instead of 0.005, we would be able to produce your product along with the products of other customers, because yours is very unique with this requirement. So, of course, what did we do? We went back to the engineer who developed the specification and asked them, could they live with 0.005? The answer was, sure. Now that, of course, evoked another question. Well, why did you have 0.005 in the first place? Why? The answer was pretty obvious coming from an engineer's perspective. Well, that was a fairly safe specification. The tighter the tolerance, the more likely we are to get a better quality product. But after all, I can live with 0.05. Remember, engineers are trained not the way you and I are, but they're trained to look at things differently. And their perspective was the tighter the tolerance, the better. But from our perspective, the tighter the tolerance, the higher price. The result of that discussion internally and externally was a 38% reduction in supply costs. Fairly significant, more than we could have ever gotten by just saying, give me $1 off or give me 10 cents off of your price. Okay, another example. We changed the material of a particular product from plastic to metal. Now, you and I both know that it costs more generally to produce a product in metal than it does in plastic. So we asked the supplier, why would you want us to change the material from plastic to metal? And they said, well, all of our other customers have the same product, but they're buying it in metal. We went back to the engineer, the end user, and they assured us that metal would work just fine. They specified plastic only because that had been specified before, and again, that specification had existed for decades. We changed it to metal and received a 16% reduction in purchase price because no longer was our product a unique requirement. Another example. We revised the delivery date to allow for earlier delivery. Now notice I say earlier delivery. This was because their delivery schedule, their production schedule fit better with an earlier delivery. Our end user didn't care if they got it a little bit earlier. In fact, they were delighted And in return, we got 11.2% reduction in price because it fit their production schedule. Another one was we increased the purchase quantity by 15% because the supplier said if you increase it from X to 1.15X, we can give you a better price. We did, and we received an 18% reduction in overall purchase cost because it fit their economic order quantity or whatever terminology they were using. Now this principle applies to service as well as products. Give you an example. We had a specification that required certain service to be available 24/7. Now that is probably one of the most misused set of numbers in the world today. Most IT people and others use 24/7 just because it sounds good. But the end user finally agreed with the supplier that they could live with 16 hours a day, 5.5 days a week, rather than 24/7, and we received a 47% reduction in annual contracted cost. And we met all of the requirements of the end user by having 16 hours, 5.5 days. Now, recognize all of these came about as a result of asking one question. Let me share something with you that may surprise you. This set of examples, as well as dozens and dozens of others, were with sole source suppliers. Think about this. We were going to suppliers to negotiate where they were our only source for the product, which is, by the way, one of the reasons we got creative and started asking them this sort of question. So all of these were from sole source suppliers where our likelihood of ever getting a price or cost reduction was near zero to go in with. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where we add value to the organization. Okay, I want to share another perspective with you, just a little additional to what we've talked about. What is the most critical information in any negotiation? What is the most critical information? Certainly lots of information is important. What is the most critical? What are the supplier's needs and wants? And interestingly, as I mentioned before, suppliers are trained to know what our needs and wants. By the way, suppliers get 2 to 3 times as much training as we do in the purchasing side. I found that from running organizations on both sides. Suppliers are trained, so we need to stop and find out what suppliers' needs and wants are. Now, when I say that, do they distinguish needs versus wants? Now, again, to be sure that some people who may not be familiar with the term need and want, need versus want is if I work for a company, I need to get to work every day. I need transportation. But I don't need to be chauffeured in a limousine. I don't need to have a Rolls Royce or a Cadillac or whatever car you happen to desire. I don't need that. I may want it, but I don't need it. We need to be sure that suppliers distinguish needs versus wants. Now, how can we determine what their priorities are? The answer always is ask questions. Ask questions. Now, do our end users' needs and wants matter? Of course, that is just as critical to us, not more critical, I want to emphasize, just as critical as the supplier's needs and wants. The question is, do our end users distinguish needs versus wants? The examples we had on the previous page were all needs versus wants, weren't they? They were lists, they were specifications and statements of work where an end user or an engineer or someone indicated what they wanted. It wasn't what they needed because we found that out when we went back and challenged them. Okay, so again, we need to be sure end users distinguish needs versus wants. Now that brings us to a very critical perspective. Do our designers or end users understand the impact of their decisions on cost, on price, on other elements like warranty, et cetera, et cetera? Do they understand? How can we be assured that they understand? And does not that require an internal negotiation? Because think about it, those discussions we had after the suppliers told us 0.005 was too much or 24/7 was too much, those were internal negotiations. And we need to recognize, again, negotiation fits our definition where we are working with internal as well as external. Okay, now having said that, what is the goal of any negotiation or the resulting contract? Ultimately, our Are we not really trying to buy for our organization a quality product or service? Is that not, in fact, our focus, to obtain a quality product or service? Now, it is important that we be able to illustrate to our end users, to our engineers, program managers, etc., what impact they have. So I'm not an artist, want to emphasize that, but I think diagrams may be the easiest way to educate us and educate our end users or our engineers. Here is what we need to have them recognize, that while we may be after a quality product or service, that the scope that they give us in that, whether they give us in a purchase requisition or otherwise, that specification or statement of work that defines the scope of what it is we are buying has a direct impact on cost to perform the product, provide the product or perform the service, and the time required to provide the product or perform the service. A direct link, a direct impact. As I increase the scope, I also increase the cost and probably the time required to perform, don't I? So use this to illustrate to your end users that while they're developing this specification or statement of work, it has a direct impact not only on the quality, but also on the cost and the time. I want to just propose a question. When the cost or price to buy a product or a service is higher than what is desired by the organization, who is responsible? We, you and I, the purchasing professionals, are responsible, not the engineers, not the end users, it's us. So it's up to us to educate and train them in terms of the impact what they do has on what it is that we do. Okay, I want to move on. I want to talk about power. Power in negotiation, as we mentioned earlier, the misuse of it, the misunderstanding of it, is one of the most significant areas of mistake. So we need to address that. What is power? Let's define power. It is the ability of a negotiator to influence the behavior of a counterparty. Now, behavior includes decisions, okay? The ability of a negotiator. Now, again, whether it's personal or professional, if I can influence the behavior, the decisions of the other party, I have power. So let's use that as our basic definition. Now, recognize something. Power is relative. Rarely does one party have all the power. I can tell you in many, many years of negotiating, many types of transactions throughout the world, I have only found one case where one party had all the power. Think about that. Now, we're not going to get into that, but the point is that you and I need to recognize that almost never does one party have the power. The question is, are we aware of the other party's limitations or constraints? Now, I'll warn you that when I put something in red, that is critical that you make note of that, because this is where we really need to think differently, change our perspective. Are we aware of the other party's limitations or constraints? Now, the reason I say that is because power generally results from the other party's vulnerability. That is, if we have the vulnerability we talked about earlier where the end user needs the product right away and you and I are faced with negotiating with a supplier with a very short time frame, the other party can recognize we have a vulnerability. The other side of it is when the supplier really needs to close that deal by the end of this month or by the end of the quarter, we recognize they have vulnerability, which is why many of us make sure we negotiate our contracts toward the end of a quarter. Now, recognizing that vulnerability, how do we determine their vulnerability? What's the answer? Ask questions. This is where our strategies and our tactics really allow us to determine their vulnerability. Now, we also have to be aware that they are trying to determine where our vulnerability is, and we therefore need to protect the knowledge of our vulnerability. You and I both know that majority of the time suppliers obtain information about the vulnerability of us, our organization, from people outside the procurement organization. It's up to us to close those doors. All right. Recognize the holder of power may shift. Again, I mentioned this when we talked about abuse or misuse of power. We need to recognize when a supplier forces us to do what we don't want to do, or we force a supplier to give us concessions they don't want to give us. Ultimately, when the power shifts, they will get even. We've seen this over and over again in business cycles. Now, that's why we say the use of power has ramifications. So again, we need to recognize that. Now, we can't talk about power without talking about one of the most significant aspects or subjects of power, and that is power with single and sole source suppliers. Probably one of the negotiations that the majority of us hate, and I will share with you that I happen to enjoy because it's the most challenging. Okay, we need to talk about the power that exists when we negotiate with single and sole source suppliers. Who has the power? Think about it. Of course, we know who has the power is the supplier. Who created the power, or what created the power? Well, it's not in fact the specification or statement of work that created the power. You and I know that. We know that intuitive. We know that from experience. But we need to be sure that others recognize it. So, when is the best time to influence the single or sole source decision? It's not after we get the purchase requisition, is it? When is the best time? We know the answer to that. It's earlier involvement. We recognize that. Most organizations spend a great deal of time and effort trying to determine how they can have an earlier involvement. It certainly is best at the design stage. How can we convince our management that earlier procurement involvement is imperative? And this is what I want to share with you. Now let me tell you that the next chart came from my first position in procurement. I had been managing and directing contracting organizations where we were negotiating contracts for sale of products. And one day, our VP, Senior VP of Procurement, turned to me and asked me to take over the procurement organization. Of course, my first question was, does this constitute an increase in salary? No, just kidding. My first question was, why? And he said, well, you have done a really good job of negotiating internally and externally for our contracts, our sales contracts. We want you to add that same expertise to the sales side, to the procurement side, because these people are really lousy negotiators. So I agreed to do it, but I asked for 2 weeks to analyze what was going on in the procurement department and determine what might need to be done. I received that. I am a rather anal person, so I did a lot of diagnosis, a lot of analysis of figures and statistics. And what I found was something that really surprised me and ultimately shocked our organization. That was that in that procurement organization, 66% of the purchasers were single or sole source. Think about that. Our purchasers, our supply managers, were being held responsible for being lousy negotiators because they were doing a poor job of negotiating with single and sole sources. So we developed this approach, if you will, to try to train or educate management in terms of what that did to us as a procurement organization. So let's share a quick chart. This is called the negotiation power shift. Now on the vertical axis we have power, which is different levels of power, and on the horizontal axis we have time. So as we go over time, we recognize that power shifts over time. Now recognize two primary time frames. One is when we determine our requirements, that is when we draft the specification or statement of work, and secondly when the product is delivered. Those are our primaries. We want to recognize that in this thing, purchasers and sellers have different levels of power. And we have one additional portion, which is where supplier selection is made. Certainly everyone recognizes power shifts, okay, when the supplier selection is made. But let's look at something. What we found was that the purchaser has all of the power when they are creating a specification or statement of work. Now think about that. You and I know that, but how do we illustrate it to our management? The seller, on the other hand, at the time we're developing a specification or statement of work, they have none of the power, unless, of course, they're influencing the end user or the engineer, which we, of course, have to watch out for. Now, I will grant you these lines are not linear, but very clearly this illustrates that we have all the power and the seller has virtually none of the power when we're developing the requirements, but later on in the cycle that crosses, and, of course, when it comes time for product delivery, they have virtually all the power and we have none. Again, just a way to specify why we need internal negotiations. And again, this is how we demonstrate or prove our strategic value to our organization. Okay, I want to talk real quickly about strategies and tactics. That is not something I want to spend a lot of time on because you can get training on the subjects elsewhere. Okay, what's a strategy? Overall approach. This is our general approach. A lot of definitions, a lot of books, etc. Collaborative, competitive, win, 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 lose, etc., etc. Bottom line is there are two primary ones. That is collaborative or cooperative, and collaborative or competitive. Okay, but selection of the appropriate strategy requires that we think about our relationship. I want to emphasize, we should not negotiate always using the same strategy. We need to consider the relationship with the supplier, with the counterparty, if you will. One thing I will emphasize, again, it's in red because it's important, avoid a collaborative negotiation if your counterparty selects a competitive strategy because they will take away many things and give nothing, so be careful. Now, tactics. What are tactics? They are the processes. They are the tools that we use to achieve our overall objective. Now, tactics should be consistent with the strategy. It's very important that we don't adopt a collaborative strategy with competitive or controversial tactics. So again, be careful for consistency. The primary purpose of tactics is generally to obtain information. Now, we need to emphasize something here that is really good. The best negotiators are conversant with multiple strategies and tactics. I only mention that to give you a context for a couple of real quick slides. I don't spend a lot of time here because we don't have the time talking about tactics, but I want to point out two tactics that people in our seminars have said these have been invaluable to them. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about the tactic that's called what if. Now, as the name implies, we ask the other party what would change if we changed the timing of the requirement. We allowed for early or late delivery. We changed the specification or statement of work. We eliminated the warranty. We supplied the materials, etc., etc., etc. This is sort of an extension, if you will, to the first question, which is, remember, what can we do to help you reduce your cost of producing a product or providing a service? Now, this is where the supplier really doesn't know. So then we propose different things to them. Very powerful. Very powerful. We're not going to spend time on the counter tactics, but just recognize this is very, very important to us. Okay, one more. The other one is, again, we talk to people that give us feedback in terms of taking strategies and tactics back. Well, this one is, as the name implies, this is called silence. This is where you throw out a question and you just sit there very quietly. Even when they answer the question, sit there sit there longer and say nothing. If your counterparty is a talker, let them talk. And by the way, in case you haven't noticed, most salespeople are talkers, okay? You will get invaluable information. Now, I want to recognize something here, and that is you have to be careful. You are sure how long you can be comfortable with silence because many people are not comfortable with it. We feel a need to fill the void. This is actually a tactic that works very well personally and professionally. Okay, I want to move on till we have time for questions. I want to talk about a subject, again, that we review very, very detailed in our seminars, and that is people talking about telephone negotiations. Now, I want to share a professional perspective. Telephone negotiations are very challenging and very problematic. Let me tell you why. First of all, when I was training on the sales side negotiations, we called it negotiation by ambush because we could pick up the phone and call the buyer or the engineer for the buyer, and we could start a discussion, and it sounds like a discussion, but it really was a negotiation whereby we obtained concessions, and they didn't even realize that we were negotiating. So that's why we call it negotiation by ambush. Now, for that reason, we always emphasize in our policies and procedures, do not accept a telephone negotiation unless it's scheduled. And then recognize that the informality of a telephone call usually results in a lack of preparation. So we have to prepare as if it were a face-to-face. Use the exact same checklists and templates that you do when you prepare for a face-to-face negotiation. Otherwise, we will lose that negotiation. Use the same checklist. Now, do not accept interruptions. I have very seldom been in a negotiation with a supplier in a room, in a conference room, or in my office with the door closed where someone would interrupt because they knew that we were negotiating. But I've often been on the phone with a supplier negotiating, and people will interrupt because they don't stop and think about what I may be doing on the phone. So it's important that we recognize we don't accept interruptions in a telephone negotiation any more than we would have in a face-to-face negotiation. Now, make sure both parties are committed to a result. From the very beginning, when you start that conversation, you do the same thing you do in a face-to-face negotiation, and you say, do you have the authority to settle this agreement today? If the answer is no, you discontinue the phone call. Same thing in a face-to-face negotiation. If they are not committed and don't have the authority to commit to the result, then we are wasting our time. They will merely get concessions from us and give us nothing in return. Okay, recognize something very, very important. It is very easy for someone to say no on the phone as compared to face-to-face. Did you ever notice that in your personal life? So don't negotiate with your spouse or your significant other or with your children or your parents or with your friends. Don't negotiate on the phone because it's much easier for people to say no. And we will see when we negotiate that the word no is not a word that we want to hear. Okay, let's wrap it up. A couple quick conclusions. I always like to kind of recap a couple points that we've made and perhaps punctuate them. First of all, I hope that everyone recognizes the negotiation process gives us an opportunity for both parties to be creative. It gives us an opportunity to stop and look at things differently, to not see each other as adversaries, but to see each other as, see each other as parties, counterparties who are out to reach agreement. We want to look at things cooperatively rather than competitively where we can, but recognize something we said before. If the other party adopts a competitive or challenging perspective, we must respond in kind. Start all negotiations with what we call the most important question. Remember, the most important question is, what can we do to help you reduce your cost of providing this product or service or extend the time frame, etc. Information is the lifeblood of negotiation. The most important information in any negotiation is what the other party needs. Let's stop looking at this thing myopically, as we in purchasing have been trained to do. Let's look at it cooperatively and determine what their needs are. This is where skill is required. I think hopefully you can see that the skills we get as a result of the things that we've talked about today are the skills that we can take to personal and professional negotiations. That's where we get the information. Negotiation and power is relative. Remember, one party never has all the power. So when you're facing that single or sole source supplier, what do we need to do? Find information about their vulnerability, about what they may need. And finally, everyday life provides negotiating opportunities. I want to repeat that the best negotiators I have observed in the world were those that looked at this as a life skill and they practice it at every opportunity. Use these opportunities wisely. Okay, we're going to now open it up to questions. I've provided you with an email address with which you can ask questions later on, but right now let's open it up to questions. We'll go back to our moderator for NLPA.
Thank you so much, Ernest. That was a wonderful presentation. So just a few quick reminders for anybody who joined us late. I do see a couple of questions asking about the slide decks. The slide decks are available to anybody who is currently certified as an SPSM in good standing, enrolled in the SPSM certification program, or enrolled in the All Access training program. So if you have one of those three criteria met, you can download the slides. If you're interested in getting that access, definitely recommend contacting our office. You can reach us at email address info@nextlevelpurchasing.com, or by calling area code 412-294-1990. Our staff would be more than happy to help you gain access to those benefits. Another reminder for questions, there's a Q&A section at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You can enter your questions in there and send those over to you. I will collect them and ask Ernest. Ernest, I do have a quick question for you. We've noticed from the NLPA a propensity for many people to negotiate electronically, so negotiating via email, via text. What are your thoughts on negotiation by email?
Well, I would probably start out by saying that the same hazards exist as we have in telephone negotiations. For example, inadequate preparation, etc. We have, in addition, no biofeedback, such as body language or eye contact, so both parties are at a disadvantage. Now, I recognize that in today's environment, people desire to do as much as they can by email, but I'm emphasizing that negotiating electronically is just as dangerous and hazardous as negotiating with a telephone, and we need to avoid those at all costs.
Great. Well, we have a question from Lauren Williams. Lauren asked if you could provide an example of a question you would use to determine a supplier's need versus their want.
Okay, so I'm going to provide an example. I am negotiating with a supplier, and I have done my homework, so I have an idea what they're going to bring to the party, so to speak. When I start the conversation with a supplier, I start out with that first question, right, which is what can we do? Okay, now we get beyond that now, and we say to the supplier, what would a successful negotiation look like to you? What result would you want to have? What items in your list of desires are the most important to you? Can you prioritize them from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 or whatever? So what we're really doing is giving them an opportunity to share with us their perspective in terms of what is important to them. Now, when we hear those things, at that point, we need to say, okay, is that a need or a want? So if they say the delivery date is critical, okay, is that a need or a want? Is that something that is going to contribute to, from your perspective, the success of the negotiation? So it's by asking questions and then accepting the feedback and then getting them to prioritize.
Great. Speaking of that most important question, Lawrence Rosenbaum asked, does that typically just throw off the other party and give you a competitive advantage from the start, or does it bring down their guard and just make the negotiation process easier?
That is a very good question, because if we throw it out in a negotiation where the supplier has walked into the room, to your point, to your question, it is probably going to throw them off. They're not going to have any idea how to answer the question, are they? In fact, when we're negotiating with the seller, if we're negotiating with a salesperson, they probably don't have any insight into what it may be that drives the price. So my recommendation is that you arm them with the question beforehand. You let them know that one question you are going to have for them when they come to the table is that most important question. And whether you use those exact words isn't important, but that you lay out for them something that will have them come forward with some ideas that you can then explore with your engineers, with your program managers, with your end users. Now, having said that, if we are in a truly competitive mode, not a cooperative mode, certainly you could use that as a tactic. You could throw it out to throw them off, but the challenge is going to be, again, they're not likely to be prepared when they're confronted with a question that they haven't had a chance to explore internally. Probably no more than we would be, because we don't know what went into our specification or statement of work from our end users.
Excellent. One question that came in from Koida I can actually answer is, what type of preparation is needed in a negotiation? And actually, that could be a topic for a whole nother presentation.
Yes,
and I do want to suggest, Koida, we do have an express course called Championship Caliber Negotiation Preparation, which covers that topic very much in depth. So I would consider researching that and seeing if that could be a fit for you. But yeah, preparation for negotiation is much more than the presentation Ernest provided allotted for us today. We could certainly be here for a couple more hours. All right. And Daniel Martin asked, how often would you consider getting intelligence on a supplier during the life of an agreement?
Well, that's an interesting question, because he's raised something that many people in the procurement world don't look at, which is what happens after the negotiation. So during the life of the agreement, one of the things we emphasize in our seminars is that many times, in fact, I will propose most of the time, purchasers turn their back on the agreement and they really don't go out and get any information. So they really don't know how successful that negotiation was. Because if the supplier is struggling to perform, and in fact we're receiving negative feedback, it indicates the negotiation really wasn't a success. So I guess my answer to you, Daniel, would be it depends on what we're buying and how the performance is intended to be done. For example, if I'm buying a product which is an off-the-shelf item and it's to be delivered in 6 weeks, I probably don't need to check the supplier very often. But if I'm buying a product that's custom-made and it's to be delivered 10 months from now, I probably need to check on a regular basis, maybe with milestones and that sort of thing, to determine how they're doing in the performance. But certainly I would punctuate what you've indicated with your question, which is it is important after we finish the negotiation to keep a finger on the pulse of what the supplier is doing. And the frequency is going to depend somewhat on the circumstances.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. I think what all of our attendees on today's webinar is, Ernest, in your opinion, what is the best way to reach an agreement when there's a really significant difference between what a purchaser wants and what a seller wants?
Well, probably we have to recognize that in a significant portion of our negotiations that will be the case, where what the supplier wants is going to be significantly different than what we want. My recommendation and what we try to emphasize when we look at strategies and tactics is to narrow the differences with small concessions and with cooperative tactics so that we can obtain small concessions which will ultimately narrow that significant difference. Now, having said that, I want to emphasize another part of that. It is important for us to always recognize when a party is not within a reasonable negotiating range. So if we are so far away from what the supplier wants and what we want, then we need to be prepared to walk away. Now, we can call it BAFO or whatever we call it, but we need to know when we're not within a reasonable negotiating range, because otherwise, if we continue to receive and give concessions and we can't reach agreement, then what have we really accomplished? Now, I will make an aside observation. The best way to reach any agreement, of course, is always to understand the other party's perspectives and their needs and wants.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Ernest. Ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. We are at our end mark for today's webinar. Ernest, your presentation, as always, was fantastic. Again, reminder, if anybody has those 3 criteria, are enrolled in the SPSM program, have the SPSM in good standing, or are enrolled in an all-access training plan, the webinar slides are available to you in the library at this time, and shortly the replay for today's webinar will be available as well. Thank you again, Ernest, and thank you everybody for attending today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.
You're welcome, everybody. Have a good day or evening.